It's late afternoon in Delft in the middle of winter, sometime in the 1660s, and you're walking home along a canal with your hands inside your sleeves. The light has been going since about 3, and now it's nearly gone, and what is left of it's doing the thing that light does over water in this town in this season, lying flat and pale along the surface of the canal, catching the underside of the little bridges and picking out the stepped gables on the far side in a thin gray wash before letting them go dark. The canal isn't frozen, not quite, but it's thinking about it. There's a skin forming at the edges where the water meets the stone, and where a moored boat has been sitting still all day the ice has come out from the hull in a fine plate you could break with a finger. The town smells of peat smoke, which is what everybody burns here, and under that of brewing, and under that of the canal itself. Delft is a compact, well-ordered, brick-built place, and at this hour it's emptying steadily as people go indoors. You pass a woman scrubbing a doorstep in near darkness because the doorstep is scrubbed daily regardless of light or weather, and you pass 2 men standing on a bridge finishing a conversation neither of them wants to be the one to end. Somewhere behind you the carillon in one of the church towers runs through its quarter, small bright notes falling into the cold. Your house is narrow and tall and brick, one of a row, its front pushed right up to the street with no space between it and the paving. Downstairs is where the household lives, and it's warm, and there's a fire, and there's noise, but you aren't stopping downstairs. You're going up because there's a north-facing window on the upper floor and about a quarter of an hour of usable light left in it, and after that the day is over as far as any work is concerned. Nobody in this trade paints by candlelight if they can avoid it. Candlelight is yellow, and it lies to you about color, and you'll only find out how badly in the morning. So the working day here is short in winter and long in summer, and it's set entirely by the sun, and everyone in this house has arranged their life around a window. The stairs in a house like this are less a staircase than a ladder with pretensions, steep, narrow, turning tightly, with a rope along the wall instead of a rail. You go up with one hand on the rope, which everybody does, and come out on the upper floor. There are 2 rooms up here, side by side, and they do different work. We know rooms like these existed in a house in this town because an inventory drawn up in this century listed what was in them. 1 room for grinding the pigments and preparing the materials, and next to it, the room where the painting is actually done. That division sounds tidy and administrative written down. Standing in it, it's mostly about mess. Grinding pigment is dirty, dusty, oily work that gets on everything, and you don't want it happening in the room where a nearly finished panel is standing with wet paint on it. So 1 room is a small workshop and the other is quiet. You go into the quiet one first. It's cold because it hasn't had a fire in it today and probably won't. The window fills most of one wall, small leaded panes in a wooden frame, and the light coming through it now is nearly finished, a thin blue-gray with no warmth in it at all. There's an easel with a panel on it turned slightly toward the window. There's a table with a palette and brushes lying on a cloth. There's a chair. There's a chest. There's very little else, because a room like this earns its keep by being empty enough to move around in and by having nothing in it that competes with the window. On the floor there are black and white tiles laid in a pattern, and they're cold enough through your shoes to be worth avoiding standing still on. You look at the panel on the easel for a while without touching it. This is a thing painters do at the end of the day, and it isn't idleness. In failing light, the colors flatten out and go tonal, and you can see the arrangement of light and dark in a picture much more honestly than you can at noon. Whatever is wrong with a composition tends to be visible at dusk. And then the light drops another notch, the panel goes properly gray, and there's nothing more to see. You leave it where it's and go next door. The other room is smaller and busier and smells strongly of linseed oil, which is a smell that gets into wood and cloth and stays. On the bench there's a flat slab of hard stone, worn smooth and slightly hollowed in the middle from years of use, and beside it a muller, which is a heavy piece of stone shaped like a squat bell with a flat base and a handle on top. That's the whole apparatus. Everything a painter uses begins as a dry pigment powder, and powder isn't paint. It becomes paint by being worked into oil, and the working is done here by hand in circles. You tip a little pigment onto the slab, make a well in it, add oil, and begin. The motion isn't forceful. It's light pressure and a circular sweep, widening the circle gradually until the color has covered most of the slab, then gathering it back into the center with a knife and starting again. You do this for a long time. It tests to sound as much as sight. While there's any grittiness left, you can hear it, a faint dry rasp under the stone, and when it goes silent and the paste turns glossy and drags smoothly, it's done. There's a rhythm to it that empties the mind fairly quickly. In larger workshops, this is the apprentice's job, along with cleaning the room, preparing panels, and setting out the master's palette every morning. And in the backgrounds of paintings of workshops from this century, you'll occasionally see one at it, half in shadow, grinding. Paint made this way doesn't keep well, and there are no tubes in this century. What you don't use goes into a small pouch made from a pig's bladder, tied off tight with string, and when you want it again, you prick the skin and squeeze a little out. It's an imperfect system. Ladders leak, they dry out, and the paint inside them skins over. It's also entirely adequate, and it's what everybody uses. On the shelf above the bench are the jars, lead white, which is the workhorse of every picture and by a long way the most used color on any palette in this town. Earth colors in browns and reds and yellows, black, and a few small pots kept further back that aren't brought out casually. The small pot at the back of the shelf holds a blue, and it's worth taking down and holding for a moment, because there's nothing else in this house remotely like it. It's called ultramarine, and the name is plain description rather than poetry. It means from beyond the sea. It's made by grinding lapis lazuli, a semi-precious stone, and the stone comes overland and by ship from mountains in what is now Afghanistan, which is roughly as far away as anything in this room has come. Grinding, it's only the beginning. Crushed lapis on its own gives a disappointing grayish powder, because the blue mineral in it's mixed with a great deal of other rock, and the real work is separating them, a long process of kneading the powder into a wax and resin dough, and drawing the pure color out of it in stages. The first extraction is the best and the deepest, and there's very little of it. Later extractions are paler. By the time it reaches this shelf, the good grade of this pigment costs more than gold does, weight for weight, and it's the reason a merchant paying for a painting sometimes specified in the contract how much of it was to be used and where. Most painters in this town do the sensible thing and reserve it for a small area of drapery where it will be seen, and use azurite, a cheaper blue, everywhere else. Not everyone. There was a painter working in these streets in these years who used the real thing lavishly and in places nobody would look for it. Mixed into the shadows on a white wall, into the highlights on a dark tiled floor, into the half-tones of skin, so thoroughly blended that you can't see it as blue at all and can only feel that the picture is cooler and quieter and more truthful than it has any business being. He wasn't rich. He did it anyway, and it's one of the more interesting decisions in the history of the trade, to spend the most expensive material available on an effect the viewer will never consciously notice. You put the pot back at the rear of the shelf where it lives, and wipe the slab, and set the muller down on its side so it doesn't stick. You go down, eat, and come back up much later with a candle, not to work, but because the room is quiet and the house below isn't. The window is black now, and the small leaded panes have gone opaque with condensation and frost, blooming outward from the lead in feathered patterns you can scrape at with a fingernail. Delft after dark in winter is one of the quietest places in Europe. There's no traffic. There are no lights except what leaks from shutters and the occasional lantern moving along a street at the pace of a walking man. The night watch goes round, and you hear him before you see the light, footsteps on stone, the slow measured kind, and then the hour called out somewhere to the east. Under everything there's water. The canals lie still and cold and give off nothing but a faint smell, and when the ice is forming, a sound that people who live here recognize and visitors find unsettling, a soft, irregular ticking and cracking as the sheet grows and settles against the stone. This town remembers a night that wasn't quiet. 11 or 12 years ago, on a morning in October, the city's gunpowder magazine went up. It was heard 150 kilometers away on the coast. A quarter of Delft was destroyed, 200 houses razed and 300 more damaged, the great trees sheared to stumps, the roof and windows of the new church wrecked. Among the dead was a painter, Karel Fabricius, buried in his own house while at work on a picture. Everybody here of a certain age was alive for it, and it left the town with an open scar of cleared ground that took years to build back over. It also left a habit. People in Delft notice loud noises, but tonight there's nothing to notice. The candle gutters in a draft coming under the door. The tiles are freezing. The panel on the easel is invisible, a rectangle of slightly deeper dark against the wall, and you leave it alone, because whatever you did to it in this light you would undo tomorrow. You take the candle and go back down the ladder stairs with one hand on the rope. Morning comes late and grudgingly in a Dutch winter, and the first thing that happens isn't sunlight but a general gray lifting, as though somebody has turned something up very slightly. You come back up. The frost inside the glass has softened into runs of water gathering along the light and dripping onto the sill, where there's already a stain from every previous winter. And then the window starts to work. This is why the room is arranged the way it is. The window faces north, which means it never receives direct sun at any point in the day in any season, and that isn't a compromise but the entire point. Direct sunlight moves. It swings across a room over the course of a morning. It changes color as it goes. It throws hard shadows that are in one place at 10 and somewhere else at noon, and it makes serious painting from observation nearly impossible, because the thing you're looking at won't hold still. North light does none of that. It's indirect, reflected off the whole sky rather than coming from one point in it, and it's therefore soft, even, and almost unchanging from mid-morning until the afternoon fails. It's also cool and slightly blue, which is why the pale walls in this room look faintly gray, and why the shadow under the table has a color in it rather than being simply dark. Painters have wanted north-facing windows for as long as painters have needed to see properly. And in a town of narrow, tall houses, having one on an upper floor is worth arranging your household around. You stand in front of the panel. The light is coming up now, flat and even in blue-gray across everything in the room, falling on the tiles, on the cloth over the table, on the edge of the chair, laying itself down on each surface without drama and without moving. It will be like this, more or less exactly like this, for the next several hours. Downstairs, somebody opens a door and closes it. Outside, along the canal, someone is breaking the ice at the edge with an oar so a boat can be got out. And the day, such as it's at this time of year, begins.